Hello, everyone. Tonight, we're going to dim the lights and step back into a summer evening that has haunted an entire community for more than 3 decades. It's June 1992, the kind of night that should have been about laughter, promises, and futures just waiting to unfold. Graduation day in Springfield, Missouri. Imagine the smell of grass still clinging to the air after a warm afternoon, cars parked crookedly along suburban streets, the sound of kids in caps and gowns echoing through the neighborhoods. But that joy, that ordinary celebration, is about to collapse into one of the most unsettling mysteries in American true crime history. A murder mystery has occurred, except the most chilling part is that no bodies were ever found. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you really like what I'm doing here. It's what keeps me here whispering through your speakers at midnight. And hey, tell me in the comments where you live and what you do. I always wonder how close some of you might be to the shadows of these cases. Now turn off the lights, lie back on your comfy cushions, and let's get moving tonight. The story begins at a high school graduation. 18-year-old Stacy McCall and her close friend Suzie Streeter had just crossed that stage, collected their diplomas, and hugged classmates they might never see again. They were part of Kickapoo High School's class of 1992, a school that oddly enough also counted Brad Pitt among its alumni. That's your little strange detail for tonight. Springfield was proud of its students, proud of its safety, proud of being just big enough to feel like a city, but small enough to feel like a town. The girls spent the evening hopping between several graduation parties. They danced, hugged, posed for Polaroids, and made plans. Stacy had intended to sleep over at another friend's place, but at the last moment, both she and Suzie decided they'd rather spend the night at Suzie's house. Maybe it was the exhaustion of the night. Maybe it was teenage instinct, or maybe it was something darker pulling them there. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether that decision sealed their fate. Waiting at Suzie's home was her mother, Sherrill Levitt, a 47-year-old single mom who worked hard as a hairdresser. Friends described Sherrill as practical and no-nonsense, the kind of woman who kept her little home spotless and her yard neatly trimmed. She was proud of her daughter, though she'd been cautious about some of Suzie's choices of friends in the past. That night, she had stayed up a bit later than usual, chatting with her own friends on the phone before heading to bed. The house at 1717 East Delmar Street was a single-story, white-painted place with green shutters, a quiet home in a quiet neighborhood. Picture it: a flagstone path leading up to the porch, a street lamp throwing pale light onto the yard, and a dog named Cinnamon restless in the shadows. It should have been safe, it should have been ordinary. But by morning, all three women, Sherrill, Suzie, and Stacy, were gone. Now that's the end of the overview you've probably heard in news blurbs or in brief summaries online, but what I want to do with you is sink deeper, right into the texture of that night. Imagine Stacy yawning as she tossed her shoes into the back seat of her car. Imagine Suzie checking her makeup in the rearview mirror even though it was long after midnight. Imagine Sherrill locking up her beauty kit for the night, pouring herself a glass of iced tea and flicking off the living room lights. The house settles. The clock ticks past 2 in the morning, and then nothing. A void, a blank stretch of hours that no one can explain. When friends arrived at the house the next day, they found cars parked outside, purses inside, keys on the counter, makeup bags sitting open. Everything suggested the three women had every intention of coming back. That's the chilling part, because absence leaves more noise than presence ever could. But hold that thought, because the real shock comes with what those friends saw, what they touched, and what, without realizing, they might have erased forever. The sun climbed slowly that Sunday morning, June 7, 1992. Birds sang in the trees, the kind of morning you'd expect after a long night of celebration. Except at 1717 East Delmar, a strange quiet pressed down. The driveway looked normal. 2 cars were parked neatly, Suzie's red Ford Escort and Stacy's Toyota Corolla. Everything outwardly suggested that the house was full of sleeping teenagers too tired to face the morning. But when friends began to knock, there was no answer. First came Janelle Kirby, one of Stacy's closest friends, who had expected the girls to join her for a water park trip that morning. She rang the bell. She called out their names. Nothing. The door, she discovered, wasn't locked. That's our strange detail tonight, because in Springfield, people sometimes left doors open back, then believing the town was safe, believing that bad things didn't happen here. Janelle stepped inside, her boyfriend trailing behind her. At first glance, everything seemed ordinary. The small home smelled faintly of coffee, the carpet freshly vacuumed, the kitchen tidy. Cinnamon the dog padded around anxiously, barking in bursts, as if trying to communicate something urgent. Then Janelle saw the purses. All three were neatly lined up in the living room, each containing money IDs, even cigarettes. None of the women would have left them behind willingly. On the back porch, there was another unsettling clue, a shattered globe from the porch light glass scattered on the steps. Janelle's boyfriend, trying to be helpful, swept it up without thinking. Imagine that, the very first piece of possible evidence erased by the well-meaning hands of a visitor. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether that broken light was the result of a struggle or just an accident from the night before. Inside the bedroom, the beds were undisturbed sheets, smoothed flat, suggesting that none of the women had slept there. Stacy's neatly folded clothes lay on a chair, her jewelry resting on the nightstand. Susie's makeup kit was open, as if she had set it down just moments earlier. Sherrill's book sat face down, a reading light still switched on. Every item whispered routine. Every detail screamed interruption. Phones rang throughout the day. One call, Janelle later recalled, was answered by a man's obscene voice, heavy breathing, followed by vulgar comments. She hung up, disturbed. Moments later, the phone rang again. This time, silence. Some speculate it was a prankster, someone playing games with the news of a disappearance. Others wonder if it was the perpetrator himself, toying with those who were closest. By early afternoon, panic began to set in. Janelle and her boyfriend called the police. Springfield officers arrived, but what could have been a carefully preserved crime scene quickly devolved into chaos. Friends, neighbors, relatives, they all came and went, dozens of people walking across the carpets, touching doorknobs, moving objects. The house was contaminated before it was even officially secured. That was mistake number one. Officers tried to gather what little information they could. They checked nearby hospitals, believing perhaps the women had been in an accident. Nothing. They contacted other friends, hoping the trio had just decided to sleep elsewhere. No one had seen them. By nightfall, the weight of dread began to crush everyone involved. The city itself reacted in waves. Local news stations broadcast urgent pleas for information, their anchors' voices trembling with the gravity of it all. Remember, Springfield was not used to this kind of darkness. Crime, yes, but three people vanishing, seemingly plucked out of their own home, that was unheard of. As daylight faded on that first day, officers noted small anomalies. The blinds had been left open, which was unusual for Sherrill, who preferred her privacy. A television set glowed faintly, its channel static-filled, and in the ashtray on the kitchen counter lay cigarettes, one still crushed mid-smoke as though it had been abandoned in haste. Outside, neighbors recalled nothing suspicious. No screaming, no struggle, no commotion, just silence. The void stretched into evening and then into night. And so it began, the house at East Del Mar, transforming from a home into the hollow heart of one of America's most confounding unsolved cases. By Monday morning, the story had already slipped into every diner, every school hallway, every whispered conversation in Springfield. The words Sherrill, Suzie, and Stacy were on everyone's lips. 3 women gone. The local police, already rattled by the sheer oddity of the case, had to make quick decisions. They needed to treat this as a missing persons report, but from the very beginning there was an uneasy awareness that this could be something much darker. Officers arrived at 1717 East Del Mar to officially process the scene, but they were met with an uncomfortable reality. The house was no longer pristine. Friends, family members, and curious neighbors had all walked through it the day before. Handprints smeared the doorframes, cigarette ashes were tracked across the carpet, and the garbage had been emptied. Even the phone's answering machine, a bulky plastic unit with tiny cassette tapes inside, had its messages erased. No one could explain how or why. Was it a nervous family member? Was it someone covering their tracks? Investigators and detectives are still debating whether those lost messages held the very voice of the abductor. The Springfield Police Department wasn't equipped with a major crimes task force back then. This wasn't New York or Los Angeles. The officers were earnest, but they were learning on the job. One officer later admitted that they didn't even rope off the house with crime scene tape until much later, an oversight that would haunt them in every documentary and podcast for the next 30 years. Still, they started cataloging what they could. Susie's red car was parked directly in front, locked but tidy. Stacy's Toyota sat nearby, her shorts and sandals neatly folded in the passenger seat. Both vehicles, both purses, both sets of keys, yet no women. Cinnamon, the little dog, yipped nervously in the background, circling the living room as though chasing an invisible shadow. Detectives began knocking on doors, canvassing the neighborhood. Some neighbors swore they had seen Stacy and Suzie arrive home late at night. Others recalled nothing at all. One neighbor mentioned hearing the sound of gravel crunching under car tires around 3 a.m., but couldn't say which direction it came from. A handful of residents remembered fireworks. After all, it was graduation night. Could the sound of a struggle have been muffled under that celebration? Media vans began arriving by the afternoon. Local anchors stood on the sidewalk outside East Delmar, their voices carrying a strange mix of urgency and disbelief. The footage survives a modest house with a neatly trimmed lawn, a swinging porch chair, and reporters speaking into microphones about the unthinkable. It was the early 1990s when missing persons coverage was only just beginning to take the form we recognize today, and in Springfield that spotlight burned hot. The detectives faced an immediate dilemma. Was this a runaway case? 3 women choosing to leave everything behind seemed impossible. Was it a robbery gone wrong? Nothing valuable appeared to be missing. Or was it something far more sinister, a targeted abduction carefully planned and executed? They interviewed Sherrill's co-workers, who described her as reliable, punctual, and fiercely protective of her daughter. Disappearing without notice was simply not in her character. Suzie was remembered as spirited and outspoken, but not reckless. Stacy was gentle, almost cautious, known for her soft voice and thoughtful demeanor. The profiles painted the picture of 3 women anchored in their lives, not the kind of people who would vanish voluntarily. Still, whispers began to circulate. Maybe Stacy had been followed home from the party. Maybe Susie's past connections to rougher crowds had caught up with her. Maybe Sherrill had interrupted something she was never meant to see. The theories spread like wildfire because silence is a vacuum, and in that vacuum everyone fills in their own version of the truth. As night fell again on Springfield, officers finally admitted what no one wanted to hear: foul play was suspected. This was not an accidental disappearance. Something deliberate had occurred within those walls, and the trail was already growing cold. And while police worked late into the night out on East Delmar Street, the porch light, its glass globe freshly swept away, cast a dim, lonely glow over an empty yard, like an unfinished sentence waiting for its ending. Word count 1. 7:32. Waiting for continued part 4. By the third day, the town of Springfield had shifted from confusion to full-blown speculation. Everywhere you went, the supermarket, the gas station, the church pews, people were piecing together theories like amateur detectives. The problem was none of it fit neatly. 3 women don't just vanish from their own home with cars, wallets, and even the family dog left behind. It was as though they had been scooped out of reality and erased. Law enforcement leaned into the possibilities, but every avenue only deepened the fog. The first theory was the simplest: maybe the women had staged their disappearance. That thought lasted about as long as it took officers to glance at the purses still resting in the living room. Nobody stages a vanishing act without their ID, cash, and cigarettes, especially not in 1992. The second theory suggested they'd been caught up in a random burglary, but again, nothing was stolen. The television, the jewelry, the VCR, all untouched. If an intruder came to take things, why leave the valuables? But take the people. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the motive could have been something less obvious, something more personal. Then came the darker ideas. Maybe one of the girls had been targeted. Stacy, blonde and sweet-faced, was the kind of girl who drew attention. Suzie had been outspoken, and sometimes that brought friction. Sherrill had her own adult life, her own circle of clients and acquaintances. Could someone have singled them out deliberately? A chilling thought that 3 women were silenced, not by accident but by design. The media frenzy didn't help. News crews descended, each segment more dramatic than the last. Reporters spoke in hushed voices about the Springfield Three, a phrase that stuck. Flyers plastered the city, smiling faces under bold letters missing. Each photograph seemed too normal, too alive, which only made the disappearance feel more unreal. One unusual detail stood out in those early reports: the phone calls. Friends had already mentioned obscene messages left on the answering machine. When the tapes were found erased, suspicion turned quickly to the idea of a stalker. Was someone watching the house? Was the erasure deliberate, meant to hide his voice forever? Police admitted that those tapes could have been critical evidence. Now they were gone, like the women themselves. Meanwhile, tips poured in. A gas station clerk claimed he'd seen the trio around dawn. A truck driver swore he spotted them at a rest stop heading out of town. A waitress insisted she'd served them breakfast that morning. Each tip was logged, each followed, and each crumbled under scrutiny. This was the era before surveillance cameras were everywhere, before cell phones tracked our movements. Once someone vanished, it was terrifyingly easy for them to slip off the grid. The debate stretched beyond Springfield. FBI analysts weighed in, behavioral profilers sketched out scenarios: a single perpetrator with knowledge of the women's routines, or perhaps two men working together, forcing them silently from the house. The lack of struggle puzzled everyone. No one had heard screams. No neighbors recalled commotion. How could three people be taken quietly in the middle of a residential street without so much as a broken lock? The silence itself became evidence. And as days turned to weeks, what started as panic began to harden into dread. Candlelight vigils were held, mothers clutched their daughters a little tighter, and fathers double-checked the locks on their doors. For the first time, Springfield felt less like a safe hometown and more like a place where shadows stretched too long. And in that thickening darkness, police knew one thing with certainty: the case was no longer just missing persons. They were staring into the cold eyes of an abduction. The further investigators pushed into the background of the Springfield Three, the more the case began to take on the texture of their lives, threads that seemed normal until you looked closely and saw the tiny fractures. Let's start with Sherrill Levitt, the matriarch. At 47, she was steady, respected, and loved by her clients at the beauty salon where she worked. She'd gone through a divorce and raised Suzie mostly on her own. Friends described her as meticulous. She didn't just clean the house, she polished it. She balanced bills, saved carefully, and worried about her daughter's choices, especially Suzie's circle of friends. Sherrill wasn't the kind of woman to make enemies. If anything, her greatest trait was reliability. She kept promises, she showed up, and she never disappeared. Then there was Suzie Streeter, just 19. Spirited, stubborn, with a quick laugh that could either charm you or cut you down. She loved animals, adored her dog Cinnamon, and had a taste for adventure that sometimes got her into trouble. Only a year earlier, she'd testified in a car theft case against two brothers with reputations you wouldn't want in your neighborhood. It made people wonder, could old grudges have circled back? Investigators and detectives are still debating whether her involvement in that trial drew dangerous attention. Finally, Stacy McCall, the youngest at 18. She was described as soft-spoken, almost shy. The kind of girl who remembered birthdays, who would write you a thank you card for something small. Her friends adored her. If she had a flaw, it was indecision. She second-guessed herself constantly. That's why on graduation night she waffled over where to sleep. Her parents had expected her home, then she changed her mind to stay with friends, and finally, at the very last minute, she landed at Suzie's. A decision that might have been nothing or everything. What tied them together was simplicity. They weren't drifters, they weren't reckless. These were ordinary women living ordinary lives, pulled together in one house on one unlucky night. Police tried to paint timelines. Sherrill had spoken to a friend around 11 p.m. talking about plans to paint a chest of drawers. Nothing unusual. Stacy and Suzie had left the last graduation party shortly after 2 a.m., telling friends they'd call in the morning before heading to the water park. They never made that call. Neighbors provided scattered observations. One swore the driveway had been empty at 7 a.m., only to be corrected later. Another said a strange van had been parked near the house days earlier. Others mentioned men hanging around graduation parties, faces no one could quite identify. Nothing fit neatly, nothing stuck. One strange detail from Suzie's past added a wrinkle: she had a turbulent relationship with a boyfriend named Dustin, tied to petty crime. Rumors swirled about fights, jealousies, and unfinished arguments. It didn't take much for townsfolk to start whispering his name, but investigators tread carefully without evidence. Suspicion was nothing but smoke. Through it all, the families held press conferences, their faces pale with exhaustion. Stacy's mother begged for her daughter's safe return. her voice cracking on live television. Sherrill's friends described her as a rock, unable to comprehend that she might now be gone forever. The human portraits sharpened the edges of the mystery. This wasn't just an unsolved case, it was 3 lives torn from a community. The profiles raised more questions than answers. Why them? Why that night? Why together? And as detectives stared at the photographs taped on their office walls, 3 smiling faces under the heading Missing, they couldn't escape the eerie symmetry, a mother, a daughter, and a friend, all caught in a vanishing act too perfect to be random. Graduation night should have ended with nothing more dramatic than sore feet and a few sunburns at the water park the next day. Instead, it became a knot of hours that investigators have spent decades trying to untangle. The timeline, though slim, is chilling. Stacy McCall and Suzie Streeter spent the evening bouncing from one party to another. They were popular girls, and June 6th was the night to celebrate. Polaroids captured them smiling, hugging friends, tossing caps in the air. By midnight, they were still moving between houses, chattering about where to stay. Stacy had promised her mother she'd be home, then pivoted to sleeping at Janelle Kirby's before finally changing her mind at the last second to spend the night with Suzie. That flip of a decision still echoes like a domino in investigators' notes, an accident of fate that tethered her to Delmar Street. They left the last house around 2 a.m. Witnesses remember them laughing, yawning, talking about the next day's plans. A detail that always unsettles me, Stacy was carrying her overnight bag, sunscreen tucked inside, still thinking about swimming pools and sunshine, while unknowingly walking toward the dark. Back at East Delmar, Sherrill had likely gone to bed earlier. She'd worked late at the salon that week and spent the evening on the phone chatting with friends about redecorating. One of those calls ended just before midnight. Sherrill was the type to double-check the locks, set down her glasses, and read a book in bed. Her life was measured in routine, which is why the scene left behind felt so violently interrupted. When the girls pulled up to the house, nothing looked amiss. The porch light still burned its globe intact at that moment, or maybe it wasn't. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the shattered glass later found was broken during the abduction or clumsily earlier in the evening. Either way, that light became a symbol ordinary and then suddenly fractured. Inside, the girls must have dropped their purses by the couch, kicked off shoes, and settled into the comfort of Susie's home. Stacy carefully folded her shorts and jewelry as if preparing for sleep. Suzie set down her makeup kit. Cinnamon wagged her tail. All signs pointed to a peaceful arrival. And then the blank stretch. No screaming neighbors, no frantic 911 call, no signs of a break-in. Whatever happened was quick and quiet. Some theorists believe the perpetrator was already in the house waiting. Others argue the women answered the door to someone they trusted. Imagine that, a knock at 2:30 in the morning, a familiar face, and 3 lives ending in silence. There was one peculiar report. A neighbor claimed to have heard a muffled noise around that hour, but dismissed it as graduation night revelry. Another remembered seeing a van parked awkwardly nearby. A boxy Dodge-style van, white or light-colored, became one of the most repeated but elusive details of the case. Sightings contradicted each other, and eventually the trail dissolved. The cruelest part of this timeline is how normal it all seemed. Every decision that night was so mundane, changing sleepover plans, stopping at one last party, driving a familiar route home. Yet those small choices aligned into catastrophe. By the time the sun rose, 3 women had vanished into the air of a quiet neighborhood, leaving nothing but toothbrushes in the bathroom, cars in the driveway, and a dog pawing at the door. And as investigators pieced together those final hours, one phrase lingered in their notes: they should have been safe. Witness accounts began flooding in within days, and with them came the chaos that so often shadows missing persons cases. Everybody wanted to help, and everybody swore they saw something. The problem was no 2 stories lined up. One woman claimed she had seen Suzie, Stacy, and Sherrill in the early hours of the morning at a nearby convenience store. She described them as nervous, hurried, buying sodas before rushing out. Police followed up, but the store clerk had no memory of such a purchase, and there was no receipt trail. This is the curse of eyewitness testimony. The brain fills in what it thinks it saw. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether this was a case of mistaken identity or a real fleeting glimpse of the trio. Then came the van sightings. Over and over, residents described a strange boxy vehicle, white or off-white, sometimes with rust, sometimes pristine, sometimes with a ladder rack, sometimes not. One teenage girl reported seeing a man leading a woman who resembled Suzie into such a van near an abandoned building. Another tipster said they saw three women in the back of a van, faces pale behind the glass. Yet when these sightings were pursued, none could be confirmed. The van became almost mythic, a phantom on wheels haunting Springfield. There were more unnerving whispers. A clerk at a local fast food restaurant swore she'd seen Stacy the day after the disappearance ordering food with two disheveled men. A retired couple on a road trip said they passed a car matching Susie's on a rural highway, driven by a man with a blank expression. Each call lit up the switchboard at the Springfield Police Department, but each dissolved into nothing. The strangest detail came from a witness who described hearing a woman's voice screaming, "Don't do this in the middle of the night," somewhere near Delmar Street. The person admitted they brushed it off, thinking it was just party noise. In hindsight, the words took on a chilling clarity. Meanwhile, psychics began to creep into the picture. Families desperate for answers sometimes welcomed them, while investigators rolled their eyes. One psychic insisted the women were being held in an abandoned farmhouse. Another said they were buried near a creek. Police, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of tips, occasionally followed up. Each lead fizzled, each location turned up nothing but dust and weeds. The public grew restless. People wanted suspects, wanted names. But without hard evidence, the police were left juggling shadows. One officer admitted later, "We had so many tips we didn't know which way was up. It felt like the whole town was hallucinating the case at once." What made it worse was the silence inside the Levitt home. The phone had stopped ringing with prank calls, but its absence was almost more sinister. The women had left no notes, no messages, no signs of struggle beyond the broken light. It was as if they had stepped out for a moment, only never to return. And yet, if you looked closely, the chaos of those early witness whispers left one undeniable impression: someone somewhere had seen something real. The truth was floating in that sea of contradictions, buried under false memories, rumors, and the static of fear. The trick was finding it before time buried it forever. Inside 1717 East Delmar, the house itself had begun to feel like a silent witness. Every corner held the suggestion of what had happened that night, and detectives walked through again and again, hoping some overlooked detail would speak. The living room remained almost painfully normal. Purses lined up like sentinels, keys jangling slightly when officers touched them, a pack of cigarettes left unopened. Cinnamon's dog toys scattered across the carpet, her claws scratching nervously at the back door whenever anyone approached. But when investigators leaned in closer, the picture turned stranger. Cigarette butts not belonging to Sherrill or Suzie were found in an ashtray, a faint lipstick stain on a coffee mug no one could identify. And that phone, its answering machine with the erased messages, sat like a silent accusation. Officers admitted they had no way of recovering what had been deleted. Even now, investigators and detectives are still debating whether those messages could have been the smoking gun. Neighbors told police that on the morning after the disappearance, a strange sweet odor had drifted through the air near the Levitt home. Some said it was like melting tar, others said chemicals. Was it a coincidence, a paving crew, a passing vehicle? Or was it something far darker tied to cleaning agents or even decomposition? No one could say for certain. The bedrooms offered more contradictions. Stacy's clothing, folded with her jewelry carefully placed on top, looked like the preparation of someone about to crawl under covers. But the bed was undisturbed, the sheets perfectly smooth. Susie's makeup bag sat open, brushes spread out, as if she had been halfway through removing her eyeliner. Cheryl's reading glasses were resting on a novel, the lamp still glowing softly. Each detail was routine, but together they were maddening, a trio of interrupted evenings. One odd discovery that still nags researchers: a light bulb from the broken porch lamp was missing. The glass globe had been shattered and swept away by a friend, but the bulb itself had vanished. Was it removed by accident or deliberately pocketed? Some believe the abductor may have unscrewed it to darken the porch before approaching an act that would suggest planning rather than impulse. Police also noted faint scuff marks near the back porch steps, as though heavy objects had been dragged, or maybe it was nothing more than worn paint. Without photographs taken in time, those marks faded into the noise of speculation. What the house did not give was equally important. No blood, no signs of forced entry, no overturned furniture. Whatever had happened, it had been quiet, controlled, precise, and that in many ways was the most chilling discovery of all. By the end of those first weeks, detectives admitted the house had yielded everything and nothing. It whispered possibilities but refused to shout answers. Every cigarette butt, every missing bulb, every erased tape hinted at a story, but only fragments, never the whole. And as the investigation dragged forward, East Delmar became less of a home and more of a shrine, the air heavy with unsaid words. People driving by slowed down, staring at the blinds, drawn tight, wondering what secrets lingered just beyond them. Because if walls could talk, those walls would have told the tale of the Springfield Three. Instead, they stood in silence. By midsummer of 1992, patience was wearing thin. Springfield wanted suspects' names, handcuffs, something tangible to ease the gnawing dread. And slowly, the list of people under the microscope began to grow. At first, police looked close to home. Jealous boyfriends and recent exes came under questioning. Stacy's on-and-off relationship had been a point of teenage drama, but nothing concrete tied him to the disappearance. Suzie had dated a young man with a reputation for trouble, and whispers suggested his friends were mixed up in shady deals. Investigators leaned in hard, but alibis checked out, and none of the boys showed the kind of cold precision it would have taken to abduct 3 women without leaving chaos in their wake. The circle widened. Springfield wasn't free of darker figures, career criminals, men with long records of theft, assault, and worse. One name that surfaced early was that of a handyman who had done work near the Levitt home. He was known for odd behavior and had a history of making women uncomfortable. Rumors spread that he drove a van, the very vehicle witnesses kept mentioning, but no direct evidence connected him to the case, and eventually interest in him cooled. Still, the shadow of organized crime crept into the narrative. Sherrill, after all, was a woman in her late 40s, self-reliant, independent. Some suggested she might have crossed paths with dangerous people, maybe even witnessed something she shouldn't have. That theory, though tantalizing, was built more on fear than fact. Detectives admitted they couldn't trace any clear mob connection. The most compelling suspects, however, emerged from the criminal underworld just outside the city limits. These were men with violent reputations, drug traffickers, burglars, men who had already demonstrated a willingness to intimidate and silence. One name in particular caused a stir, a man serving time for kidnapping and assault, whose past offenses included luring young women into cars. His modus operandi echoed the whispers of a van circling Springfield. Police interrogated him, but his answers were slippery, and with no physical link to Delmar Street, he walked back to his cell, untouched by charges. There were also whispers about rivalries within Springfield's small community of criminals. Suzie's name came up in old police reports as a potential witness in a fraud case. Could her disappearance have been an act of silencing investigators, and detectives are still debating whether she was targeted specifically or whether the women were chosen simply because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time? Through it all, the community kept staring at one simple fact: 3 women had vanished without a sound. Whoever had done this wasn't sloppy. They weren't impulsive. They were careful, methodical. The broken porch, light, the unlocked door, the absence of blood, it all suggested a plan. That alone narrowed the suspect pool, but it also made the search infinitely harder. And as the weeks turned into months, Springfield realized something chilling. This wasn't just a mystery. It was the work of someone who knew how to make people disappear. The suspects' list grew longer, but the answers remained out of reach. With no arrests and no bodies, desperation began steering the investigation into stranger territory. Tips about burial sites poured in, fueled by rumor, by fear, and sometimes by dreams. Each one promised resolution. Each one ended in disappointment. One of the most persistent theories centered on the parking garage being built in downtown Springfield in the early 1990s. Whispers spread that the 3 women had been buried in its foundations before the concrete was poured. A construction worker claimed he'd seen freshly dug earth late at night. Another insisted he heard screams echoing through the unfinished structure. Before long, the garage became less of a building and more of a tomb in the town's imagination. When police considered ground-penetrating radar decades later, hope surged. Maybe the answers had been under everyone's feet the entire time. But scans of the site revealed nothing definitive, just anomalies in the soil that could have been pipes, rocks, or shadows of 100 unrelated disturbances. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether digging further would risk more than it revealed. Then came the psychics. Some families turn away from them, but the Levitt and Streeter relatives were so desperate they sometimes listened. One psychic described the women lying beneath water, faces turned upward, their hair floating. Another swore they were in a shallow grave under a green barn just outside of town. Police, careful not to appear dismissive, followed a handful of these leads. Each one produced nothing but weeds, dust, and disappointment. Not all the tips came from outsiders. A local man claimed that a friend of his had drunkenly confessed to helping move bodies late that June night. But when questioned, the supposed confessor denied everything. Another tip placed the women in a remote area of Webster County, dumped in a well once used by farmers. Deputies lowered cameras and sensors into the black water. No bones, no clothing, no sign of the three. The strangest and most haunting came from a woman who swore she saw 3 figures in shallow graves while horseback riding in the Ozarks. She gave detailed directions. Police rode out, dug carefully. They found disturbed soil, but no human remains. What they did find was a cluster of animal bones bleached by time. Despite the futility, each search carried the same dread, the possibility that the nightmare would become reality, that 3 skeletons would be uncovered side by side. Detectives admitted privately that they both longed for and dreaded that discovery, longed for it because it would mean closure, dreaded it because it would mean the worst had indeed come to pass. As the years dragged on those burial sites, theories became part of Springfield's folklore. Teenagers dared each other to visit the parking garage at night. Local papers ran anniversary pieces rehashing the psychic visions. The case was slipping from investigation into legend, and with every fruitless dig, hope dimmed a little more. The earth, it seemed, refused to give up its secrets. The shadows of the Cox brothers loomed large over the Springfield Three investigation, and for many locals, their names became synonymous with suspicion. Dustin and Michael Cox were not strangers to law enforcement. They had reputations for violence, drugs, and intimidation, the kind of men who knew the darker corners of Missouri. When whispers tied them to Suzie Streeter, the police paid close attention. Suzie, as it turned out, had testified against Dustin Cox in a car theft case months before her disappearance. The courtroom encounter had been brief, but the bitterness lingered. People wondered, could this be revenge, the cruel silencing of a witness? The timeline fit uncomfortably well, and the motive seemed almost too neat. Rumors escalated when acquaintances of the brothers claimed they had bragged about making girls disappear. One jailhouse informant went further, insisting Michael Cox had confessed to being involved in the abduction of the Springfield Three. According to the inmate, the women had been taken, murdered, and buried in a remote area near Webster County. But like so many leads in this case, nothing could be confirmed. When investigators searched the suggested site, they found nothing but dirt and empty beer cans. Still, the Cox connection refused to die. They fit the pattern too well: young, volatile, tied to criminal networks, and harboring a grudge. Detectives leaned on them hard, questioning them multiple times. Both brothers denied involvement, their answers shifting between outrage and cold indifference. Without physical evidence, no fibers, no DNA, no fingerprints, the police couldn't pin the crime to them. And yet Springfield couldn't shake the suspicion. Neighbors recalled seeing strange cars parked near the Levitt home around that time, sometimes with unfamiliar men inside. Others swore the Cox brothers had been lurking at local hangouts, dropping cryptic comments. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether those stories were genuine recollections or the town's paranoia filling in the gaps. The brothers' criminal histories didn't help. Assault charges, burglary, drug trafficking, each added weight to the theory that they were capable of something darker. But capability isn't proof, and the law demands proof. By the mid-1990s, the Cox brothers had become a ghostly presence in the case. Mentioned in nearly every article, suspected in nearly every conversation, but never charged, never convicted. For some in Springfield, that was as good as guilt. For others, it was the maddening reminder that suspicion isn't justice. The Springfield Three remained missing, and the Cox brothers remained free. And in that uneasy balance, the mystery deepened. False confessions are a curse in every high-profile case, and the Springfield Three were no exception. As months turned into years, men behind bars began stepping forward, each with a story more dramatic than the last. One inmate claimed he had personally helped kidnap the three women, describing a late-night ambush and a shallow grave in rural Greene County. Detectives listened, intrigued by his confidence, until his details unraveled. He couldn't describe the Levitt home, didn't know the make of Susie's car, and placed the women's disappearance on the wrong date. It was a performance, nothing more. Another man insisted the women had been trafficked out of state, sold into a shadowy network that specialized in making people vanish. He spoke with the kind of chilling authority that makes you sit up straighter. But when police pressed him, his sources evaporated and his story collapsed into silence. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether he was lying for attention or repeating rumors he'd heard on the prison grapevine. The most unsettling false confession came from a drifter who turned up at a police station in Oklahoma. He said he had picked up 3 hitchhikers matching the women's descriptions and killed them in a fit of rage. He even drew a crude map of where the bodies supposedly lay. A search team scoured the site, dense woods and shallow streams, but found nothing. The man later admitted he had fabricated the story after reading about the case in a newspaper. Why do people do this? Some psychologists argue it's a twisted form of attention, seeking a way to grab headlines from behind bars. Others suggest guilt over unrelated crimes pushes offenders to align themselves with famous cases. And some perhaps simply enjoy the power of holding investigators hostage with half-truths. For the families, these confessions were a cruel roller coaster. Each new claim meant fresh hope, fresh dread, and inevitably fresh disappointment. Janice McCall, Stacy's mother, once admitted the hardest part wasn't the waiting. It was the constant lurch between believing answers were at hand and discovering it was another mirage. The noise grew so overwhelming that detectives began developing a sharper filter. Unless a confessor offered details that hadn't been made public, the position of an object in the house, the color of Sherrill's nightgown, they dismissed the story outright. Still, each lead had to be checked, because what if this one was the truth? By the late 1990s, false confessions had clogged the Springfield file, layering fiction over fact, until the two blurred. Each new voice claiming guilt only deepened the silence of the missing three. And somewhere, if the real culprit was still alive, he was watching from the shadows hidden among the liars, letting the noise drown out his crime. As the 1990s bled into the early 2000s, the case of the Springfield Three grew colder by the season. Leads thinned, detectives retired, and the once frantic urgency settled into a weary rhythm of anniversaries and vigils. What remained was the heavy presence of absence. Every June, families and friends gathered with candles, photographs, and soft-voiced prayers. Stacy McCall's mother, Janice, became the anchor of those vigils, her voice trembling but unbroken as she reminded the community that the case was not just a headline, it was her daughter's life. Susie's friends often joined, their faces lined with a grief that had matured into quiet endurance. Sherrill's co-workers from the hair salon sometimes stopped by carrying flowers and stories about her warm humor. Television networks caught on. Dateline specials, local documentaries, even paranormal programs gave the Springfield Three renewed attention. Each episode brought a brief surge of calls to the police, a flurry of tips, then the inevitable silence. The women were slipping from living memory into cultural mythology, their names carried less by fact and more by whispers. Meanwhile, the investigators themselves aged. Men who had once pounded the pavement in search of suspects now spoke from rocking chairs in retirement, haunted by what they hadn't solved. Some admitted the Springfield Police Department's early missteps, like failing to secure the crime scene, still gnawed at them. Others insisted they'd done all they could with the tools of the time. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the case was doomed by bad luck or bad procedure. Technology was changing, but in those cold years, it hadn't yet caught up to the evidence. DNA analysis was still in its infancy, databases were limited, and without bodies, even advanced forensics had little to work with. The ashtrays, The hairbrushes, the smudged fingerprints, these artifacts sat sealed in boxes, waiting for science to catch up. For the families, waiting was a torment. Janice McCall once described walking past her daughter's bedroom and feeling both comforted and stabbed by its familiarity, untouched yet unbearably empty. Friends of Suzie talked about how they would sometimes catch themselves expecting her sharp laugh in a crowd. Sherrill's relatives struggled with the fact that she had vanished at the very moment she was building a stable, independent life. The case, though unsolved, became a part of Springfield's identity. It was the story parents told their children when warning them not to leave doors unlocked. It was the subject of late-night conversations in diners, of whispered theories in high school hallways. The Springfield Three were no longer just missing, they had become a kind of ghost story woven into the city's DNA. And yet beneath the rituals and the retellings, the raw truth remained: 3 women were gone, and nobody knew where. Time was supposed to heal, but in Springfield, time only deepened the mystery. The new millennium brought new hope carried on the back of science. DNA analysis was advancing rapidly, and the Springfield Police Department began reopening its evidence boxes carefully cataloged and preserved since 1992. Cigarette butt strands of hair fibers all suddenly had the potential to speak after years of silence. In 2002, investigators launched one of their most ambitious searches. A tip led them to a piece of land in Webster County. Heavy machinery churned through the earth, digging deep trenches, while families held their breath. The ground yielded bones, but not human. Animal remains once again mocked their hope. Then came 2007, when technology allowed a fresh look at Sherrill's house. Evidence collected there, including fingerprints and hair samples, was re-examined. Some partial DNA profiles emerged, but they were incomplete, degraded, and frustratingly inconclusive. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether better preservation techniques back then might have given today's tools a chance to provide a match. In 2010, a construction worker's story reignited the old rumor of the parking garage. He claimed he had seen suspicious activity during the building's foundation phase, something he had kept quiet about for nearly 2 decades. Police brought in ground-penetrating radar again, this time with far more advanced equipment. The scans showed anomalies beneath the concrete, large voids or disturbances that could, in theory, conceal bodies. But drilling into the garage risked structural collapse, and city officials hesitated. The debate still lingers: did bureaucracy protect the garage, or did it bury the truth? Another wave of hope came in 2019 when authorities announced they were using new forensic genealogy methods, the same techniques that had caught the Golden State Killer. Families of the Springfield Three leaned in with cautious optimism. Perhaps those cigarette butts, that hair, could finally link to someone's family tree. But as of today, the results remain sealed, if they exist at all. In between those scientific breakthroughs came heartbreaks. Bones found near Lake Springfield turned out to be decades older than the women. Remains discovered in Arkansas proved unrelated. Each time, headlines screamed possibility, only to collapse into the word negative. The cycle was cruel, a pendulum swinging between desperate hope and crushing disappointment. Still, each new test reminded Springfield that the case wasn't forgotten. Science was a slow partner, but it was a partner nonetheless. And every year, as technology sharpened, people whispered the same thought. Maybe the Springfield Three had left behind a trace so small, so hidden, that it had simply been waiting for the right machine to uncover it. The tragedy was that even science couldn't rewind the clock. Evidence degrades, memories blur, leads go cold. The longer the case lingered unsolved, the more fragile those traces became. But still, people clung to that fragile hope that one day a database match or a soil anomaly would finally break the silence. More than 30 years have passed since that summer night, and still the questions hang heavy over Springfield. The house on East Delmar has changed hands, the porch light replaced the dog long gone. Yet the shadows of Sherrill Levitt, Suzie Streeter, and Stacy McCall linger like echoes in the walls. The enduring mystery lies not just in their absence, but in the layers of contradiction left behind. A broken lamp that might mean nothing or everything. A van described by dozens but never found. Erased phone messages that could have held the voice of a killer. Every detail feels both ordinary and sinister, like a puzzle designed to drive people mad. Springfield itself has changed. Children who grew up with missing posters taped to telephone poles are now parents themselves, telling their kids to lock doors and travel in groups. The case became a generational warning, a whispered reminder that safety can vanish in a single night. Academics and true crime writers have dissected the Springfield Three endlessly. Some argue it was a targeted abduction Suzie silenced because of her testimony against Dustin Cox. Others believe it was random, a crime of opportunity committed by men in a van trolling the neighborhoods. And then there are those who lean toward darker, almost cinematic theories. Burial under the parking garage ties to organized crime or involvement of people long dead. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the truth is in plain sight or buried under decades of false leads. For the families, the passage of time has been a cruel paradox. 30 summers without answers, 30 winters of waiting. Janice McCall once said she still sets a place for Stacy at Christmas, not literally, but in her heart, leaving space for her daughter to walk back through the door. Friends of Suzie keep photo albums yellowed by age with the same smiles frozen forever. Sherrill's co-workers still remember her laugh echoing through the salon. The Springfield Three are not forgotten. They have become a symbol of how mysteries can swallow entire lives, how one summer night can stretch into an eternity of unanswered questions. And yet beneath all the folklore and theories, the simplest truth remains: 3 women went missing and no one has brought them home. Maybe the answer is still out there, buried in a field, sealed in a box of evidence, or whispered by someone who has never spoken aloud. Or maybe the silence will hold forever, leaving only speculation and grief. As Springfield drifts into another year, the case sits in limbo. Not solved, not closed, not forgotten, just suspended like a breath waiting to be released. And so the story ends not with resolution, but with the weight of what's missing. 3 women, 3 lives, 3 names etched into the city's memory: Sherrill, Suzie, Stacy. The lights are still off on East Delmar, and the night remains. Sometimes mysteries don't end. They stretch on like ghost stories carried from one generation to the next. The Springfield Three is one of those stories. We've walked through the house, examined the clues, followed the suspects, and waited for the earth itself to speak. But the silence holds. What makes this case so haunting isn't just the disappearance, it's the feeling that the answer is close, maybe even right under our noses. The broken porch light, the erased messages, the van that half the town swears existed, all of it feels like a riddle missing one final piece. And yet, as the years pass, the Springfield Three become more than just a case file. They are the city's ghost, the question mark stamped on every June 7th. They remind us that safety is fragile, that life can change in the space of a single night, and that closure is not guaranteed. But here's the thing: unsolved doesn't mean forgotten. Advances in DNA, in forensic genealogy, in ground-penetrating radar, they keep pushing the story forward. One day it might be a single match in a database, one overlooked hair follicle, one scrap of a confession that finally breaks the silence. Until then, the Springfield Three remain with us, in candlelit vigils, in whispered warnings, in the faint memory of a light left burning in a bedroom that no one returned to. And so as we close this story tonight, remember their names, because remembering is a form of keeping them alive. Sherrill, Suzie, Stacy. Now turn off the lights, lie back on your comfy cushions, and let your thoughts drift. The night is long, and some mysteries keep us company in the dark.